Dr. Christy Jackson founded Query in 2002 and is an internationally recognized expert in NVivo. She focuses on the use of NVivo in a diverse array of health, education, public policy, and commercial research projects through her role as consultant, coach, analyst, and principal investigator. Dr. Jackson's research interests include conceptualizations of qualitative research transparency and the constantly changing spaces where qualitative researchers and technologies meet. She's also co-author of Sage Publications' best-selling book, Qualitative Data Analysis with NVivo. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I've left my contact information up here on the first slide. I will put this up again at the end in case anybody misses it. It's always easy to find me at query.com. And I'm happy to chat afterwards if you have questions or make my slides available to you directly. So feel free to reach out to me. And before I start, please also note that I've created these CLIC retreats primarily for doctoral students, where you come and work only for a short time in large group settings. Then we have some small group sessions, one-on-one, and some time for you to do independent work over the course of about 3 days. And if you're feeling especially motivated, you can stay a 4th day at no extra cost. You'll find more information and dates on my website. And also note that I do provide a lot of phone consultation with doctoral students, usually about 2 to 5 hours, I would say, is average. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like some of that help. Okay, so just to be reminded, this is the second in 4 sessions that are in this series about NVivo and your dissertation, so you might be interested in the other sessions as well. And let me go ahead and give you an overview of this presentation. I'm going to wander through quite a few different things here. Please note that instead of talking about how to click through the software, the focus in this session really is about how to think about your lit review and how to think about it in relationship to the software. So I'm going to start with a brief discussion of the focus and timing of the literature review and an aerial view of the process. Then I want to get into a little bit of a debate about what should be the scope and purpose of the literature review. And then I'm going to switch to NVivo, where I will go through quite a few different tools just as a way for you to think about how you might use some of these tools with your literature review. And then I want to end with thinking about 2 different metaphors as you construct your literature review and wander through the process. And these relate to the debate that I'll introduce earlier on, and we will end with some general tips. So I would like to start with a great summary that Pat Baisley provides about the focus of a literature review. And she has 3 areas that you're going to need to consider while you're looking at materials: topics, theories, and methods. And so topics are things like optimism in low-performing schools, and that's the example I'll use for the rest of my session, mentoring immigrant employees, and all sorts of other very specific topics. The theories or approaches are things like critical race theory or symbolic interactionism. And your methods are things like interviews or constant comparative coding as ways of approaching that data. So the topics, the theories, and the methods are all things that will come up in your lit review. These sometimes may be closely related to your study, and sometimes you may find, for instance, a piece that has a methodological approach that you really like, but it's done in a topic area that doesn't have anything to do with your research. And that's okay, especially if it's something innovative that you want to borrow from. So think about these 3 arenas. Okay, so the next thing is the timing. I've taken a little liberties here to create a table based on this article, and what the article does is try to identify how much literature review occurs before, during, or after data collection, because in different approaches it can be positioned before, after, or during. And so the darker the cell here, the more prominent that timing is in that methodology. Again, this is not exhaustive, and it's not intended to be a guide for you. If you're doing case study, I don't want you to think that you shouldn't ever do any literature review during your data collection and analysis, but it gives you a sense of these different moments. So you might want to check in with your chair, with your committee, and with people that are doing research in your methodology to think through when and how much and what kind of a literature review to do. All right, next, the process. Cresswell provides a really nice aerial view about what's involved in the lit review, and that's identifying the terms to use, locating the material, reading and checking its relevance, organizing it, and then writing it up. And that's basically the process that you'll go through. Again, this will vary from methodology to methodology, but those are key steps to think about. So with those basic foundational understandings under our belt, it's important to know that there is a little bit of a debate about the scope and purpose of the literature review. So I want to start with the first metaphor here, which is the foundation debate. And I am pulling from an article that identifies the very limited amount of research that's been done to understand the role of the lit review on research. So you might find it helpful to look at this article. And one of the things that comes up in this article is that the common understanding of a literature review is as a foundation. So as a result of looking through lots of materials and doing a review of literature reviews, these authors say that the literature review should always situate the study, that it should justify decisions around the scope of the study, and that it should critically examine claims rather than just report them, right? And to note if those claims are warranted. So the emphasis in this approach is on a thorough or exhaustive review that's comprehensive. And that's why I'm calling this the foundational metaphor. So here's a symbol that I'm going to put up that represents this foundational metaphor. So your lit review forms the platform on which the rest of the dissertation is built. And you built this nice, broad, steady, strong platform that the rest of it leads to. So this is just one way of thinking about a literature review. Another way to think about it is a systems metaphor. And this is really well articulated by Maxwell in his article. And Maxwell identifies the importance of being, instead of thorough and comprehensive, being relevant. So relevance should always trump being thorough and comprehensive. He also says that this approach would lend more to the surveying of a select group of studies that you think are really good and really relevant, to provide a lot of detail about the relevance of the select group, then to describe the contributions of this to your study and indicate how your study will move beyond them. So unlike the last metaphor that was more of a platform, we're calling this a systems metaphor because here the idea isn't to build this big broad platform, it's to find important connections. So the emphasis here in this image is the connections. Now keep in mind before I move forward, these are all just heuristic images that I'm putting up. You're going to use a mixture of these most likely, and these aren't the only two, but the problem is in the literature review process, researchers often aren't being reflexive about how they are prioritizing the scope and purpose of the lit review. So I'm trying to put two of these up here to help give you some bearings and to think further on them. So now I want to talk about the tools in NVivo that you might use, and I'll go through quite a few. I'm going to start with Memos and Links. So on the right I have an article, and this is about low SES schools and optimism in schools. So let me just read a piece of this article. There exists at the elementary level a lack of research that describes conditions contributing to academic optimism. This research helps to fill that void by identifying, describing, and categorizing the norms, behaviors, strategies, and other pertinent characteristics that exist in a low SES school that is established and is maintaining an academically optimistic environment. And that's very typical, right, of the scholarly language you'll see in articles. So one of the things you'll note here is on the other side of the screen, on the left side, I have a memo or a journal where I've written some interpretations. And again, I'm just sort of postulating and wandering mentally. And what I say here is most of the most of the studies on optimism seem to be focused on low SES schools. And I wonder how many occur in high SES schools. Could there be an unwarranted assumption that optimism in low SES is more rare, more powerful, or more necessary for success than in high SES? If so, is this presumption just about low SES schools, or is it a larger assumption about low SES and success? So I'm covering lots of ideas here about what might be going on in the literature and what might be going on in the assumptions. And so here's the nice thing about doing this in NVivo. Instead of just having this memo inside NVivo and the article inside NVivo, you can create links between the memo and the piece of the article that you're talking about. When you're done, you can export the memo as a Word document, and so that Word document, represented by text on the left, will have embedded links in it to endnotes. So the endnote would be the quotes from the different articles, and you can link as many articles as you want. So by the time you're done, you could have a lot of writing and thinking and links to quotes, and you haven't done any coding. So definitely think about the relevance of writing and linking with memos and articles. And the tool that you use to link is called the See Also link, which is available in the Windows version of the software. And all the images I'm providing from here out are from the Windows version. You'll find a nice table on the QSR website that compares the functions of the Windows and the Mac versions in case you want to look at that later. Okay, so the next tool, coding. So here's the same article, but instead of writing and linking to think about it as I read, I can also code it, and I can even code it with multiple codes. So I could code, and NVivo calls them nodes. Those are the categories that you code to. So I code to a node for low SES, and to a node for communication, and to a node for expectations. So I've done this rich layering. And that text at the very bottom is the only text on the screen that's coded at all three places. So here, then, I move to the next tool, which is a coding query. And in the coding query, here's a Venn diagram where low SES, expectations, and communication intersect at the center. NVivo doesn't have visuals that look like this, but the Venn diagrams you can find in the help files. And the center, where all three of these intersect, if I ran this query, the text that was the bottom part of the prior screen would show up as a result. So that result represents all the data that's coded all three places. Okay, now on to the next tool and the next way to think about your literature review. In addition to this coding that I showed you earlier, you can also add characteristics like what year the article was published or what state it was published in. Now, if you're using EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley, or RefWorks to import a bibliographic database or a referencing database, NVivo will use and leverage a part of the system called the classification system, and you'll find more about that again in the help files. What I want to do now is show you a little bit of a shortcut, because you don't have to migrate a bibliographic database over to look at comparisons like a publication year. And I want to show that to you briefly. It's called Sets in NVivo. So I'll even show you a screen of NVivo here. This is what PDF files would look like on the screen in NVivo. And if I highlight, for instance, the articles that occur farther back in time, I can right-click on them and create as a set, and then I can name that set Articles from 2001 to 2005. That set will reside in the collections area of your database. And once you've created sets, which just point to these items, you can then use them in different searches. So I could create a set of Michigan, I could create a set of 2001 to 2005, any way you want to sort the data. And sets don't have to be mutually exclusive. Now, as a result of being able to do that, putting things in these groups, you can run a matrix. So now I'm getting to my next tool. So here's a table, and let's say I was looking at policy documents, and I want to look at policy documents based on the state that they emerge from. So in the top I have the sets. So let's say I have a set for Colorado, Florida, Michigan, and Texas. And on the left-hand side I have those nodes that I coded to, low SES communication expectations, and it's telling me how many passages I have from those different articles about those different concepts. Any cell that has a number can be double-clicked on, and it takes you right to the data. A great thing about using this tool is that most of us are trained to focus so much on the internal logic of the article. Do the methods fit the research question, and are the findings warranted? Those are ways we critically look at a research study. This actually will help you look across articles in a way that can help you see things that you might not have seen otherwise. Okay, now I want to move to another tool. This is the result of one of the sort of text mining tools. This is a text query where the word scores, as in academic scores or high scores, it's showing up in a branch. So you see the words that come before the word scores and the words that come after in a tree. So this is helping you think critically through the language that's used to examine what's going on in the data. It's more of a content analysis approach than it is writing about the data or coding the data manually the way I showed you earlier. All right, now let's get to visualizations. So here's a simple project map in NVivo, and these are all nodes, right, or my coding categories. So I have a node in my project called Priorities. It has subnodes for communication and goals, and there's subnodes under that. So it's almost a taxonomy of my coding structure, and the project map can help you display that. A really nice tool in NVivo is the ability to click on those nodes from inside the project map and actually go to the data. So they're linked to the data to help you think and navigate around. One more visualization is a concept map. So here, instead of using items that are in the database, I'm doing some thinking about what's happening. And so here I've made this proposition that people who see challenges and advantages both as opportunities for growth in the school or for understanding, I'm saying that those schools that have that culture are likely to have more optimism. And I'm also postulating that once they have more optimism, they're more successful. I have a double-headed arrow between success and optimism because I'm postulating that once this success occurs, then there's more likely to be additional optimism generated out of it. So once again, this is a pretty simple concept map. You can put all sorts of shapes, colors, and kinds of arrows to represent the way you're thinking about the data. And remember, this is just the data based on the literature. All right, so now I'm going to switch here near the end of the presentation to an article here by Bruce. And I'm getting back to these two examples I had earlier of language and thinking about that language in the literature review in terms of the way people leverage different words to talk about the purpose of the literature review. So Bruce identifies terms like listing, searching, and surveying, and I've added to those with words like thorough, exhaustive, comprehensive, comparative. And Bruce identifies that kind of language as foundational types of terms, where you're thinking about the literature review as a big, broad, sturdy foundation for the rest of the study. Whereas the other kind of thinking, or the other kind of language, which is more likely to be about learning, facilitating, and reporting, to that I've added relevant, construction, and generative. So one is more foundational and one is more systematic. Okay, so the reality is, again, these are heuristic, and you're more likely to use both approaches, but I do think from my experience that people are unaware of which one they're gravitating to or why, and it's good to be reflective about which one you intend to leverage and what you want to accomplish with it. In fact, I think it would be a good idea to talk to your dissertation chair or your committee members or your colleagues about the role and purpose of a literature review. Does it differ from one study to the next, or is it a common way to approach all literature reviews? And think about the adjectives people use and then the tools they describe in NVivo to be able to accommodate that approach, and see if you can sort of uncover from the people that you talk to whether they see a lit review as more of a foundational type of contribution to the study or more of a systemic contribution. And so finally, I have some ways of thinking about a few of the tools in NVivo. So as I've read this literature and looked at a lot of issues around conducting literature reviews, if you're using a foundational metaphor, your memos and links are more likely to be core ideas that occur throughout the literature. Whereas if you're using a more systematic approach or systemic approach, you're thinking about creative ideas. If you are coding with a foundational metaphor, you're more likely coding lots of materials and the goal is to distill that into a summary. Whereas in a systemic metaphor, you're more likely to want to find creative connections and interesting overlaps that are relevant for your research. If your foundational approach is using queries, you're more likely to look at absence and presence of certain concepts and different types of materials. Whereas in the systemic metaphor, your queries are more geared towards looking at relevance, the weight of things that are more important. Finally, visualizations. If you're looking at this from a foundational approach, your visualizations are more likely to include things like logic models, whereas a systemic approach, you're more likely to think about constellations and connections and creative ways that things might overlap or connect or be related. So what I have here finally is probably the reality of how you're going to wander through your literature review. So the two spirals on either side represent the foundational metaphor and the systems metaphor that are holding up the stairs. And you're going to go on a winding tour, probably back and forth between these to construct the literature review. But I wager that you'll be much more successful if you're self-reflective of when you're doing one or the other and why you're doing it and to what end. And then you'll be able to properly navigate, climb these steps, and conduct an excellent lit review. Okay, so to conclude, I have some general tips. The first is, even if you're doing a foundational type of approach, it really is important to emphasize relevance over volume. And so if you cover a lot of materials, it's not enough just to cover them and summarize them. You really need to cover them and emphasize what the importance is, the so what of looking at all that material. Next, you should integrate materials rather than isolate it from the rest of the chapters in your dissertation. I know the lit review needs to sometimes stand on its own as a comprehensive chapter, but failing to pull some threads through the rest of the chapters can leave the reader hanging a little bit about why you did that lit review and how it's connected to everything else. Look for other things you can use besides just the topics and the theories and the methods. There are things like the way questions get asked, the settings that people do research in, the people that are included in the study, scenarios, historic events, all these things are things that you might pick up as little breadcrumbs along the way that don't really have to do with writing up your comprehensive lit review, but they can give you ideas about how to conduct your research. So don't forget to create a list as you're going through your lit review of great ideas that you like that you might want to implement. Remember that you're probably going to have to revise the lit review at the end of your study. So make sure you leave time as you're writing up your findings chapters and your implications that you go back to the lit review and rework it. You're not going to have to start from scratch, probably, but you will need to more carefully craft connections between the findings and the literature. So please be prepared to go back and not just see that as a freestanding chapter. Also consider the role of material that doesn't make it into the dissertation. And there could be reasons that it doesn't make it, but you might want to waive to. It identifies boundaries of the study or juxtapositions. And so keep track of the things that you look at but don't use, because those could be useful in unanticipated ways. A big tip here is to pilot a small example in NVivo before importing everything. So if you have 200 articles, don't bring them all in. Bring in 3. Bring in 3 and do all the things that you want to do in your lit review. You might want a memo, you might want to code, you might want to run some queries or create some visual maps. Go ahead and do that with a small sample just to play with the software. It'll help inform you about how you want to handle everything when you bring it in. And then finally, this is a big tip that I am so glad I did in my dissertation. I created a node called claim, and under that I had subnodes for expository and research. And here's why I did this. Even in a research article, when you're reading it, there are places where people make claims that are based on research findings, either in that study or a prior study. And there are also times in that same article, even though it's a research article, that somebody will make more expository claims because they're accepted in the field, because it's a common theory people use, but it's not based in research. It really is based in common cultural practice. And in a lit review, it can be very important to separate out what things you're referring to that are based on research findings in your lit review and what things are just based on theory or common claims, and that's the expository material. So when I was coding my lit review, I also coded each article to these 2 nodes, and then when I was done, I could run a matrix. So remember the matrix I had up earlier that had the different states in the columns and it had the nodes in the rows? Well, here I have nodes in the columns and nodes in the rows. So the nodes in the columns are my expository node and my research node. And then in the rows I have nodes like communication and optimism. Once again, those numbers are telling me how many passages come up in that material, and if I double click on a cell, it would take me to the data. I'll tell you what I use this for, and I wasn't expecting it. It really pointed to gaps in the literature. So if one of your goals is to find out what hasn't been done in this field, you'll see places where there are gaps in the literature by running this, and you'll find places that research is needed. Okay, so I know I covered a lot of ground, but there's some final tips and some tools you might think about in NVivo. Remember, there are 3 other sessions in this series that you might be interested in. And also remember to check out my website for information about the CLIC retreats, where you have lots of opportunities to work in different ways, and that I also provide telephone consultation to a lot of doctoral students, so please feel free to reach out to me for that. So there's my contact information, which I'll leave up here at the end in case you would like a copy of the slides or just have some follow-up questions. But Kevin, I'll turn it back to you now in case some questions came in during the presentation. I'd be happy to briefly talk about those now.
Thank you, Christy.